Android devices in parallel. These are the types of things that we've always kind of been engaged in to help measure and contrast and understand practices in particular spaces.
So the FTC at 100 is increasingly engaged in looking at technology and high-tech products. This is gives you a sense of some of the cases that we've had involving huge tech companies in the last 5 years. And sometimes the FTC is even referred to now as the Federal Technology Commission because of our role increasingly in looking at the practices of these companies as it relates to the impact that they're having on consumers, especially their privacy and their data security.
And we're going to step through a couple of these cases, but to start.
So to start, one important thing, and we've been talking about it a little bit, is we have the ability to try to make sure people are marketing their products fairly to consumers and not deceiving them. So this case actually is currently in litigation. And here the issue is, does an unlimited plan that is throttled is that actually an unlimited plan? And our allegation in this case is that it is deceptive to consumers to say that they are getting an unlimited plan if in fact they're going to be throttled over certain thresholds.
Right, and here we have to understand things like how network routing works, what is congestion-based throttling versus just network management, what are, for example, SS7 and weird networking and GSM protocols that some people now in this audience know, but obscure technical underpinnings of old telco systems in order to bring this case, right? So companies would make arguments that this is how it needs to be managed, and we would say, for example, if you're capping people at 5 gigabytes regardless of network congestion, that might not be congestion throttling, and it becomes a core element of our case.
So privacy promises, this is a big piece of what we do on the enforcement side. And the reason we're spending a little time talking about a bunch of the FTC enforcement cases is that enforcement is actually one of the strongest tools that we have in our toolbox to help shape policy and practices in the private sector. Google Buzz, for example, this case involves a broken privacy promise, which is that Google made to Gmail users about how they would use Gmail information and whether they would use that in a way that was different than the Gmail users expected. And so it's relatively important because we allege that in fact the Gmail users couldn't have anticipated having their information used for Buzz and then didn't have adequate notice to be able to opt out.
And once the settlement is reached, the company is often put under order. For example, Google is under order for 20 years to maintain their privacy policies, privacy promises, and in fact have regular privacy assessments. And we then use that authority to later bring other enforcement actions. So you might recall Google was also found circumventing Safari browser settings, basically respawning Safari cookies. And we later then brought an enforcement action with monetary penalties once they're under order.
So similarly, Facebook, and in the Facebook case, again, we took a hard look at whether the representations that Facebook had made to users about how they could restrict their information were actually true, and determined that they weren't, and brought a case there. This is also pretty important because we looked at how the retroactive change to how users' information was handled actually was deceptive to and unfair to consumers. So we looked at a change in policy and tried to hold Facebook accountable for the promises that they had made.
And this is one of my first cases. I was a staff technologist at the time, 2010, and there was a lot of technical work that needed to be done. For example, we alleged that Facebook apps would have access to more information than what users were told, so you could restrict your information sharing to private, for example, via Facebook settings, but as folks in this audience know, via the Facebook API, you could pull a lot more information. You could pull whatever information the user had said. So we had to do things like understand the API, run apps to demonstrate, or write apps to demonstrate and verify our claims. There was a claim regarding deletion of photos, and so there was the need to understand how CDN works, right? So when you delete your photo on Facebook, if you deep link to that photo, it's still available on the caching network because they did not delete the photo off their CDN. There was another case with regards to sharing information, and folks here know how advertisers get information via referrer headers. So Facebook claimed that they would not share information with advertisers, but in fact your Facebook ID and perhaps the page you're on would be sent to advertisers embedded in on the Facebook page because they didn't properly iframe the advertisement, et cetera. So a lot of it, the case, the findings were, or the case was a legal finding, but we had to essentially technically demonstrate what our claims were with regards to information sharing.
If I could just sort of underscore that for a second, I'm a lawyer, not a computer scientist. Half the time I might not even understand some of the terminology Ashkan was just using, but when I can work with a technologist who does, they explain it clearly, then it helps inform our mission. So it's like a core part of why this partnership is so important. Homey. So this is a relatively recent case. Again, privacy promises. This is a company whose technology allows their clients, retailers, to track users as they're coming in and out of their retail locations. And again, we brought a case here because the company said that consumers would have the option to opt out in retail locations that was using the technology, and that they would have notice in the retail locations using the technology, neither of which were happening. So we brought a case saying that was deceptive.
And do folks know what this is, the retail tracking? So this is basically promised mode Wi-Fi sniffing, right? So you had to, the retailers and malls will install essentially access points that are passively monitoring for Wi-Fi or GSM beacons, and they will track you, whether you return to the store or where you walk through the mall. And again, there was a lot of technical claims. For example, a lot of the companies in this space will argue that the information is anonymous. They collect, for example, they might collect MAC addresses, but they use cryptographic functions to anonymize the MAC addresses. And in fact, if you guys well know that they're hashing the MAC addresses with known hashes. Oftentimes it's like 6-byte MAC address. The first part is essentially the manufacturer code, so the space required to actually brute force a hash is quite small, right? It's something like 2 to the 30th, and you can do that on a regular laptop, or you can download a rainbow table. So a lot of the argument was that when companies make claims that this information is anonymous, that we would demonstrate that in fact it's not really, right? The current status quo is you can reverse the hash, or you can go back to the MAC address. Similarly, with regards to claims about notice, companies would make claims that, like, for example, the tracking only occurred within the mall, but as you all know, Wi-Fi signals can traverse past walls, right? So the store next door would also, so visitors to the store next door would also have their information captured by this location tracking technology. So informing that, and kind of informing the pros and cons and the pitfalls were critical to actually bringing this case. And I think this is where we as a community can really contribute.
Finally, Snapchat. This is a case that's part of our ongoing effort to make sure that apps are being marketed truthfully to consumers. And in this case, we alleged it was deceptive when the company claimed that messages would disappear forever, when in fact it was relatively easy to capture them. We also had looked carefully at data security practices and some of the other practices and found that the claims being made were also similarly misleading.
And this is another, like, folks in this community, there was a talk I think in 2013 by the Straws guys about ephemeral apps and how they weren't in fact ephemeral. And this is an area where this community has contributed quite a lot in research and demonstrating that when companies make privacy and security claims, which is something we want, right? We want privacy-preserving apps, but when they're not true, it actually harms consumers and harms trust in the industry, right? So if you can Snapchat, some sensitive photos to someone and they can easily scrape that information, consumers are effectively harmed because they were proceeding or sending those photos under assumption of trust. And so in addition to kind of the deceptive claims, deceptive cases, we also bring enforcement actions against companies that fail to meet reasonable security practices. So one of the cases that I worked on was HTC. If folks remember, there was this hubbub around Carrier IQ, which was a kind of a telemetry app inside multiple smartphones, the carrier would essentially get the OEM to load this kind of logging feature to help understand how people use the phones or monitor the devices. And in fact, in this case, HTC integrated the Carrier IQ system as well as their logger in a way that, for example, broke the Android permissions model. They allowed unsigned code. The daemon was using an inetd listener bound to essentially all interfaces, so any other app could also pull information from the daemon. They enabled debug options in the production code, so it was logging all sorts of things like key presses and SMS. And so here we made the case that by this poor integration, by not having proper procedure to review code and tests and doing code signing, that they were not essentially maintaining reasonable practices, right? They broke the Android permission model and would effectively leak information to other apps.
And just a word about these security cases. We've been talking before about privacy cases that usually involve some sort of deception or a promise that's made that isn't kept. These security cases, we also use our unfairness authority to bring them, which means essentially, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that we are looking at whether consumers can avoid the harm to them and whether they are in fact harmed. And that's sort of the way we look at it. In the security context, that leads us to, take a look at whether the practices that are being used by the company are reasonable. We don't believe that they have to be, that there's such a thing as perfect security or that what we are expecting here is perfect security, but what we do start to enforce here are reasonable security measures in place to protect the consumer data that the company has. And that's where the technologists are absolutely vital to our mission, because we have to understand and have expertise to understand the security practices and procedures that are in place.
And we have a number of these apps. This was another case where multiple apps, in this case Fandango, the ticketing app, and Credit Karma, an app that you can pull your credit score, were essentially not cert validating and allowing SSL man-in-the-middle attack, defeating the whole purpose of SSL. And so we brought a case against them that by breaking cert validation, they were in fact not engaging in reasonable security practices.
And these cases also involve a deception element as well. So promising you're securing something when you're not can be deceptive.
In one of the recent cases, TrendNet, which is an IoT camera, this was one of our first IoT cases. Folks are probably familiar with this. It was a kind of a webcam that allowed essentially users and they would advertise that it could be used to monitor your baby, or it could be used in banking environments. It was a secure camera, except the secure view functionality allowed any user that could pull the IP address of the camera to pull the video feed, even if the user had marked the video as private, right? And this is one of these cases where, again, the understanding, for example, how to connect and how the network. This was a really easy one. You could connect directly to the camera, but some of the newer cams, for example, will have either bad defaults or the way they do port negotiation will allow any attacker to pull video for a number of cameras without even needing to go to the admin interface. And so these IoT cases are really interesting for us because we're trying to understand this space. There's been a number of talks here informing some of the problems in IoT, and I think this is a critical area for us.
And just a word about the harm in this case. So, it's obvious if the harm is credit card information, financial information, that kind of thing. Here the harm, though, is exposing video feeds from people's homes to the public internet. And we think that's a violation of privacy that is deeply harmful.
Yeah, I think in the case there were examples of people in various states of undress and engaged in sexual activity, which we would argue is somewhat harmful. If an attacker can review that, or not even an attacker in this case, someone can punch an IP address in their camera and watch that feed. And then the last case we'll talk about is a case called Designerware. This is an older case. I didn't actually work on this case, but it was essentially, I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. The nudity was in this case, not the earlier case. Mm-hmm. This was essentially a rat, right? So Designerware made software that allowed rent-to-own companies to monitor devices that they rented to consumers. And so the software could be enabled to monitor keystrokes, take screenshots every 2 minutes, take web camera shots every 2 minutes, and